You have probably heard the terms first, second, and even third wave feminism. They track shifting phases of the women's movement over the past 100 years or so. But according to writer Koa Beck, there is even more to that story. She details it in her new book. It's called White Feminism, From the Suffragettes to Influencers and Who They Leave Behind, which she wrote during a fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School. Koa Beck is the former editor-in-chief at Jezebel and previously was executive editor at Vogue. And she joins us now from Los Angeles, California. So nice to virtually meet you during these COVID times. How you doing, Koa?
Same. I am well, especially based on what I read in the newspaper. I'm doing a lot better than others. So
Glad to
thank
hear.
you. And thank you for the invitation.
Not at all. Happy to have you here. Let's just start with an excerpt from the book, and that will sort of set the table for the discussion to come. So I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up this excerpt, and here we go. Like a lot of oppressive precepts, white feminism is a belief system, more so than being about any one person, white, female, or otherwise. It's a specific way of viewing gender equality that is anchored in the accumulation of individual power rather than the redistribution of it. It can be practiced by anyone of any race, background, allegiance, identity, or affiliation. White feminism is a state of mind. Let's just start there. That seems like a fairly controversial thing to say because, of course, people think of white feminism as being, you got to be white to suffer from it. Not the case, eh?
No, I don't agree with that at all. And actually, when I was researching this book and going through a lot of archival materials about feminism and women's rights in my own country, I found very specific ways in which this approach to achieving gender equality has been exported to many other groups, including like queer individuals, certain women of color, especially now, I feel like, in which specifically like capitalism and a lot of neoliberal politics have shaped the discussions we have on rights, especially in my own country. I found traces of white feminist ideology and practices in a number of women of color, specifically, who are very visible and very powerful.
Are you adamant that white feminism leaves out a lot of people? Because, of course, those who would admit to practicing white feminism would say, we're trying to be very inclusive and have everybody in the same big tent. You don't believe that?
I don't. And I think that's actually one of the enduring tenets of a white feminist ideology and practice, is that the core values have actually stayed the same in terms of what is trying to be achieved. And yet, women of color, disabled people, queer people, fat people are used in this very ornamental capacity. Yet the beliefs at the core that determine and shape white feminism stay the same. And so a lot of issues that shape and impact and oppress people of all different backgrounds are not centralized in a white feminist ideology.
Okay, you've said it a couple of times now, the goals of white feminism. Maybe we should articulate what you think those are. Go ahead.
Of course. White feminism of now and 100 years ago has been very persistent in essentially crafting like a toolkit, for women and other marginalized genders to ascend in the current structure, rather than critiquing the structure itself or challenging the parameters by which we are, ushering more marginalized genders, more people of color in. So a really tangible example of that I can cite is like specifically when you look at a lot of career advice, as I do in my book, and especially given my background as a journalist and editor, I've been privy to a lot of these national conversations as they've been shaped, especially within the shadow of quote unquote feminism, however you're interpreting that. And the idea is essentially to look out for yourself and develop this very individualized understanding of empowerment in terms of negotiating a better job for yourself, in terms of, challenging like a gender discrimination or a pay gap with your own individual metrics or your own individual understanding of the company, as opposed to, looking around with the other women next to you who have probably also been discriminated against and forming a movement with them, thinking more collectively. White feminism has not prioritized those tactics, again, as an ideology.
Well, not to overly simplify it, but maybe just acting too much like blinkered men. Is that part of the issue?
I think that is a good interpretation. When I look at what white feminism has inherited from, say, like white supremacy and patriarchy, it's very similar. And it basically encourages women and other marginalized genders to take up very tangible aspects of patriarchal approaches, specifically to things like labor exploitation, and then deeming it empowering for women to practice these policies and approaches towards business, in the way that like cis men traditionally have.
If white feminism then is too enamored with the current structure, as you say that it is, what is it about the current structure in particular that you think needs to be changed if we were going to take a much broader feminist look at things?
Well, a lot of what has determined a lot of the most, I would say, like influential structures, in my own country, has been this look at meritocracy. So this idea that you must succeed again in the way things have currently been constructed, rather than, analyzing them or critiquing them or redistributing power. So in terms of a good, example I can give, within white feminism specifically, a lot of marginalized genders have had to aspire to white feminist values to be seen in this movement. So, for instance, like, a domestic worker in my country shouldn't have to desire to be a CEO or run her own company to assume a basic standard of living. But in white feminism, she has to. So I think a lot of structures that have to be challenged are governmental, in terms of people having access to affordable housing, clean water, food security, healthcare, things like that, rather than training individual people to aspire to middle class values and therefore middle class privileges.
You say in the book that white feminism has always partnered with consumerism, whether it's last year or 100 years ago. You want to amplify on that a bit?
Sure. So a surprising piece that I found in my research that, honestly, I wasn't entirely prepared to find was that specifically as somebody of my generation who identifies as a feminist, this idea that you can buy your politics, on a tote bag or, a hat or a t-shirt that says, nevertheless, she persisted, or like feminist AF. That always struck me as, very kind of new and commodified. Yet when I was going through archival research for this book, I learned that middle to upper class white suffragists, shortly after the turn of the century in this country, as they started mobilizing for the vote, they essentially did the same thing. They really homogenized, in-house, this very commercialized idea of who a suffragist was and who you were supposed to think of when you thought of women's rights, and especially the vote. And this woman was, very thin, very young, very white. She aspired to, be middle class. She aspired to be a mother and a wife. And a number of, outlets, specifically like boutiques and stores and things like that, were keen to capitalize on the suffrage movement through, flags that said votes for women, pins, bonnets, an official suffrage blouse. Macy's was deemed the official headquarters for suffrage, luggage tags, ornaments, basically the 1920s version of merch.
Well, capitalism is amazing, isn't it?
It truly is.
Now, having said that, let's fast forward to 100 years later to today. What percentage of women in America today would you think that the description you just gave would describe? Not that many, presumably.
No, and I think that's where white feminism's mechanics are in some ways laid most bare, in that it's always been concerned with elite women or aspiring to be an elite woman. And so a lot of the analysis in my book, what I pinpoint is that white feminism has always been concerned with, lofty educational opportunities and then like small business and enterprise. And it often starts there. And yet, to your point, when you look at most data about most marginalized genders in my country, and I'm sure yours as well, they're not necessarily looking to be like leaders of lofty companies or, business owners. They're looking for a basic standard of living. They're looking to have affordable housing. They're looking to, be food secure. And white feminism starts from a place of just assuming that everybody has a basic standard of living. And that's because the women often at the heart of this movement do.
Now, I've read a lot of the coverage about your book and some of the book reviews of it and so on, and it's interesting how often the name Sheryl Sandberg comes up, because a lot of people think that you're kind of taking aim at her. And in fact, given that given that one of the chapters is called Leaning In versus Leaning On, we can't be shocked that people have come to that conclusion. But maybe you could help us understand the difference between leaning in and leaning on. What's the difference?
Absolutely. So a number of feminist thinkers well before me have analyzed basically the phenomenon of lean in before it was lean in. And I think that's really pertinent to cite here. But essentially, in order to effectively lean in, in the way that Sheryl Sandberg has described in her book, and, to a larger assessment, many other white feminist thinkers before her, you need an infrastructure of care work to be able to do that. So if you are a woman who has children and you want this really white collar sort of corporate ascension, whether it's for economic security or even just, a personal vocation or passion, you will need to hire low income, often women of color, to come in and either care for your babies or clean your home or, take care of your mother-in-law or, basically tend to all of the care work that all of us are tasked with at some point in our lives. And yet to lean in essentially invisibilizes many of the needs and rights of these women who facilitate this narrative of feminist success.
Okay, my follow-up to that is this. And clearly you're not terribly concerned about offending those who are part of the white feminist movement, because you've written this book that clearly kind of takes aim at them. So I guess I want to know why you're not so worried about that, because if at the end of the day the idea is to create more allies and to create a bigger tent under which everybody can live and work together and presumably strive to achieve the things that you'd like to see, I mean, this book could really be seen as a smack in the face to a lot of those people. So why aren't you worried about doing that?
Well, I think it's also important to reframe this question within the context of women having ideological disagreements and not necessarily being, a monolith facet of society or even subscribing to one ideology, and also the urgency by which a number of conglomerates and media outlets often seek to pit us against each other and to reframe us having ideological disagreements as being catty. I think that is a very sexist interpretation of women's intellectual prowess and also our ability to frankly just be human and disagree. Having said that, an important factor I wanted to distinguish with this book is that we cannot get to a common place together with such different understandings of what equality even is. And I think that white feminism, for generations now has been very successful in interpreting equality, frankly, in racist, classist, and homophobic ways. And I think that a way for us to ultimately unite, especially in the face of patriarchy and racism, is to unlearn white feminism. And my book is an attempt to trace the parameters of this ideology, but also the ways in which it has limited feminist discourse.
Did you send a copy of your book to Gloria Steinem?
I did, actually, and
did
she
you hear
blurbed
back?
it.
She did, eh?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, because I read the PDF. I don't have the finished copy of the book. So she actually blurbed the book, did she?
She did. She said that, I'm paraphrasing, but she said that my book essentially deciphers blockades to feminism.
Because, one might have inferred that she could have had a bit of a problem with some of the stuff that you wrote. Not the case?
I don't think so. I mean, my interpretation of Gloria Steinem as a feminist figure and also of her politics is that she is not a white feminist. However, white feminists love her, but I don't think that is an interchangeable relationship, especially if you look at what she has advocated in her career as an activist and then groups that she has worked with and parallels she has tried to, effectively draw in her career. I don't consider her to be a white feminist.
How about Betty Friedan?
Yes. I do consider her to be a white feminist, in the sense that, in keeping with much of the research in my book and the white feminist ideology, Friedan's legacy is very clear in the United States, and that she was very much, in some ways, a Sheryl Sandberg of her time. And she really pushed this mantra of white collar work as the method by which all women would achieve liberation from patriarchy. And that is a white feminist narrative.
Now, how do I start this here? I hope you're going to humor me for this next question because, well, for example, there are going to be a bunch of people listening to us on podcast who don't know what you look like at all. There are going to be people who are watching us on television or on their computers or their iPhones right now who will see you and are going to be very confused when I tell them the next thing I'm going to tell them. Or let me put it this way. When I ask you to identify yourself, how do you identify?
I have a pretty fluid relationship with racial identity terms just because I am mixed race. My mother is Black, my father is white. And so I have in my life, identified as biracial, mixed race. I also identify as Black in some circles, depending on, how that's being defined. And then also, how we're like cutting that line. I have in the earlier part of my career written about the experience of passing, specifically, in front of power holders or very influential people, and the experience of being read as white when I am in fact not. And I encourage, all your listeners or, people who are watching to read that essay that I wrote, because I still get, messages about it.
Well, funnily enough, I have a little excerpt of it right here in front of me. And I think I shall read a little excerpt of that. We're going back 8 years right now. This is for Salon, in which you wrote, passing for white and straight. Police officers don't suspect me. Store owners like me. White strangers don't feel threatened by me. Racists get too comfortable with me. Homophobes unknowingly befriend me. My straight white doppelganger and I ride the subway together as I try to lose her in crowds and leave her behind at parties. I dispel her with the perpetual coming out, the casual, quote, I'm not white, the introduction of my partner. I've spent most of my adult life actively trying to evade her. But every time I sit down with new people, I know that she sits down first. Okay, Koa, 8 years later, are you still trying to evade that doppelganger?
Oh, absolutely. Especially, I feel like with a lot of the press attention, on this book, I've noticed that a big question that's looming on Google right now when I, try and find and promote certain press of my book, one of the top questions is Koa Beck white? ? So yes, I am still trying to evade her. And I think that, a big intention I had in writing that piece and getting it published in the first place is that when I was a lot younger, and I was looking for experiences of passing, especially in my own country, the narrative essentially kind of stopped around the 50s and 60s in the US, specifically with Black Americans. This idea that you would actively pass, right, to like get a better job or move to a better, neighborhood or like marry a white partner. But the implication with that is that, passing doesn't happen anymore. And so I intentionally wrote that essay to extend the narrative and show that, post Jim Crow laws, post DOMA falling, post increased queer rights for some people, if people think that you are white and straight, you are treated much better.
All right, in which case, let's finish up on this. If you would like us to have a better understanding of what white feminism is, and you would like to increase the size of the tent, what kind of winds of change should we be looking for?
I think that a good sort of control for white feminism, especially, coming off the research of this book and seeing white feminism evolve again and again, with some changing discourse and some increased literacy, is to come to feminist consciousness and gender literacy from a place of basic need. So starting a lot of gender conversations around food security, clean water, housing, healthcare, police reform. Because I think that white feminism, as I said earlier, as a practice, has often started many, many needs above that. I also think a good framework to keep in mind when approaching, patriarchy as well as, oppressive precepts is to think more about orienting yourself against systems rather than individual people. Because especially, when we look at recent movements like Me Too, there are these very influential predators who are, protected with money and power and influence. But more importantly, the best reporting in Me Too revealed the systems that have kept these predators in place and protected, and the many, many layers of assistants and executives, who knew about this behavior and kept it in place, either through, personal threats or, any sort of like direct threats to their employment, or because it's normalized, in their work culture. And I also think another important facet is to hold women accountable for abuse. I've said this before, but a concerning facet I saw come out of, the initial wave of Me Too post the New York Times reporting on Harvey Weinstein is this idea that, so many women were relieved to work in women-only environments. And when you make a statement like that, it erases a whole facet of abuse that women, especially women of color, feel in workplaces in which they are racially harassed. And so I don't think that making statements like that, or understanding abuse and power solely through the lens of gender, is a really holistic way forward, especially if we're thinking about race and class.
White Feminism is the name of the book, and we are delighted that it's brought Koa Beck, at least virtually, to our studio tonight here on TVO. Koa, it's good to meet you. Thanks so much for joining us here.
It was so nice to meet you as well, and thank you again for the invitation.